Hello, everybody. I'm Andrew.
And I'm Reverend Kosho Finch.
All right, so we are on episode 3 now of True Words, a Shingon Buddhist podcast. So for this one, we figured that we're just going to continue off of episode 2 on talking about more of the variety in Buddhist practices.
Yeah, I think we realize there's probably a lot to say in this category, so we can pick up where we left off.
Yeah, especially because we actually forgot my favorite practice, which is sutra calligraphy or sutra transcription.
Yeah, the sutra copying in Japanese, the shakyo, is a pretty big practice, actually. It's practiced in a variety of traditions. Most often, copying the Heart Sutra is the primary practice, or what's usually done.
So I've always kind of wondered why the Heart Sutra? Why is that the one that's usually chosen for copying?
Oh, that's a really long topic in and of itself, but I'll try to give a quick overview. I think partially out of convenience, the Heart Sutra is a reasonable length, so it can be limited to a single page. But it is one of those texts that is shared and recited by all Mahayana traditions as an encapsulation of the Buddha's wisdom teachings. So as an entire category of literature within Buddhism, as well as a goal of the Buddhist practitioner, the Heart Sutra sort of distills this, many ideas of what Buddhist wisdom is. So it's something that can be practiced as recitation, chanting. You often see it in art, adorned in walls or entryways to temples, on scrolls, and of course can be copied as calligraphy. So I think in that sense, the practitioner is both practicing it as written word that can be read and understood, as well as a meditative sense of tracing the kanji, the Chinese characters that are present in the sutra.
So when I first started, at least my first attempt at trying to copy the Heart Sutra, I got really frustrated halfway through because my hand was cramping, my calligraphy was terrible, I was getting ink all over the sheet of paper and it didn't really look nice anymore. And of course at that time I didn't know Chinese, and especially not classical Chinese, which is what the Heart Sutra is written in. So a lot of it just didn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, I have a similar experience. The first time I copied the Heart Sutra, I had experience with writing Chinese characters, but I was not familiar with the sutra in Chinese. So I was attempting to read it word for word, and not knowing the terminology, I was also quite lost. Later, I realized, just first you're dealing with the sacred text, and just getting into the copying and maybe not focusing so much on the word for word meaning is more beneficial. But what I've seen, especially when people are copying the Heart Sutra in Japan, is they're often doing it on behalf of someone or for a particular purpose, maybe in memory of someone. And that text is then offered at the temple. So you'll go to many temples and there's quite a large pile. There may even be a special box in which to deposit the calligraphy into.
Okay.
So the practice is maybe done for multiple levels of meaning, rather than just trying to create a perfect copy of the model.
Gotcha. Okay. Because I know, well, what happens to the sutras after they're done? I've seen some temples put it into a stupa actually and enshrine them, but what do they do with them from a Shingon perspective?
Some are enshrined, as you mentioned. Others, sometimes there's a special service done after they're collected, and the people who've had that opportunity, the collected works are burned in a special ceremony, and the merit of that dedicated. So there's a variety. Sometimes you'll see people write the calligraphy on the clothing of pilgrims. So you'll see somebody with a white pilgrim's jacket doing pilgrimages, and there's handwritten calligraphy on the back of that jacket. So it becomes a sort of a piece of art that's then worn or carried with them as part of the pilgrimage. So there's quite a variety of, I guess, focus or what happens with those texts afterward.
Okay. So that's the Shikoku pilgrimage that you're talking about?
Yeah, usually the Shikoku pilgrimage. So for listeners not familiar with that, that's the 88 temple pilgrimage route around the island of Shikoku, which is just about 1,000 kilometers. And practitioners would walk between the temples. Of course, these days it's done by bus, car, motorbike. Some people are doing a bicycle. So there's a variety of ways to engage in the pilgrimage, but traditionally it was walked. So it takes on foot probably about 2 to 2.5 months, or about 3 weeks by vehicle. And in that way, you're retracing the steps of the founder of Shingon Buddhism, Kukai Kobodaishi, walking between those temples that represent various important stories in his life, or have strong significance in the lineage.
Gotcha. Well, and of course, if anybody wants to know more about that, we have a video on YouTube regarding it as well.
That's right. Yep. There's probably a short lecture on some of the purposes and symbolism in the pilgrimage that's available.
Mm-hmm. So continuing with sutra calligraphy, though, do you think that it necessarily has to be done in the original Chinese kanji, or do you think if we were to take an English translation of the Heart Sutra and copy that, would that have the same effect?
Oh, I think so. Of course, all the sutras were not originally in Chinese, so we can't favor one language over another in that way. But recently in Japan, it's rather than copying the kanji, a lot of people are tracing outline or line drawing images of the Buddha images. So that becomes a very similar practice of using drawing or painting as meditation. And just recently, I received from Koisan headquarters several calligraphy tracing that's in hiragana. So for Western audiences, a little bit easier to trace the Japanese alphabet rather than the Chinese characters, a little bit less complex. So I think the same effect can be had. I think really what's important is that you're tracing a text that has some significance, and then, of course, that you're doing it with the proper state of mind. So oftentimes in Japan, sometimes a separate room in the temple is set aside for that practice, or people bring out tables into the main hall to do that practice. So they have the atmosphere and the mindset. And I guess, again, continuing on our theme, meditation or practice isn't limited to sitting on a cushion.
Oh, yeah, definitely, because when I do it, it feels like a meditation on its own, that sort of focus, that sort of really contemplation on the Dharma, too.
I would agree. So sometimes people do longer texts. I think the Heart Sutra, considering the meditative focus that's brought to it and the fact that you are trying to slow down, that's a good length of text to copy if someone's going to try to do it in the Chinese characters. And then if they, of course, want more, they can copy it more than once. But it may be just right in terms of length.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, because I'm trying to think about that. After the Heart Sutra, for popular sutras, there's not that much available that's a little bit longer, but not too much longer, because then you get into things like chapters from a very, very long sutra. Let's say the chapter on Avalokiteshvara's Universal Gate, which is a few times longer than the Heart Sutra then, so that would take quite a while. Or if you try to do the Diamond Sutra, that would take very long as well.
It would take quite a while. I think the only other one that I've seen copied is from the Lotus Sutra, Avalokitesvara's Universal Gate chapter. So that would be the other text that I've seen copied as a practice in that way. I think longer texts have tended to be practiced by individuals, maybe copying entire texts, but that's sort of available to do at a temple or invited to do. It tends to be the Heart Sutra.
Is there ever a practice of copying mantras?
There is.
Or would that be done in Siddham, actually, instead of Chinese?
Yeah, usually they're done in Siddham, so in the Sanskrit calligraphy. So there's a couple, I guess, practical difficulties with that. Very few people know Siddham. And the people that I've seen do it tend to be either monastics or calligraphy artists who are familiar with Siddham as a subject or object of meditation and calligraphy. So, but I haven't seen it encouraged, not to say that people can't or shouldn't, just I think those kind of practical barriers of knowing the stroke order and meaning behind the Siddham. But it is something that you do see in Shingon art, and I have seen it, offered by temple shops and things like that where someone has done the calligraphy.
Gotcha. Well, I suppose for a Western audience, it wouldn't be very different to do Chinese calligraphy or Siddham calligraphy. I mean, when I was starting out, they didn't look that far apart to me.
Yeah, I think if you're coming to either practice without a strong background, then it probably wouldn't matter. Recently, I taught somebody how to write a few words in Siddham, and they turned out to very beautiful calligraphy and found the practice to be very meditative. Just watching them, practice a few times before they actually put brush to canvas was quite interesting. So I was actually surprised and had to rethink the potential of that going forward. So I think there's probably definitely an avenue there for making that a practice.
Huh. After this, I might actually try that. I'm doing a bit of Chinese side of calligraphy, so maybe I'll try the Siddham side, actually.
Yeah, I'll have to send you. I have a book on that shows the stroke order for most of the mantras, so you can practice from that.
All right, then. So let's see. Aside from calligraphy, what are we missing? Any other practices?
Well, I think there's actually, quite a bit additional. And I guess I'll speak more specifically to the maybe overt Japanese traditions, especially Shingon.
Mm-hmm.
So flower arranging is often taught at the temples, and many Buddhist traditions in Japan have their own schools of flower arranging. So that tends to be a major practice vehicle. There's religious dance, buyo. So a lot of times people are practicing religious dance, and those offerings are made in the temples. I think Tibet has a similar tradition. Religious song. So in Shingon, Japanese tradition is known as goika. So that's the equivalent of a choir. So that's actually most of the Shingon temples in the United States have a goika group or a choir group that perform during services, and tends to be it used to be more practical, or I guess more popular, my understanding, back 40s, 50s, and 60s, and it's waned a bit in popularity, but it's actually quite beautiful, and there are still quite popular in Japan, and there are concerts, so people actually go to see this type of choir, so that becomes a practice. And then I think probably a mind-boggling number of crafts or handicrafts that you'll see involved in temple architecture, maintenance, painting. It's probably a limitless list there. But I think people do, for the temple, with the temples, that would be considered practice as well.
And definitely from a Zen perspective, there's the saying, eating and sleeping are practices.
What isn't practice?
Carrying water is practice. So,
right.
Yeah. Working in the kitchen, cooking is a practice as well.
Yeah, definitely cooking. I think that's probably even both in Chinese and Japanese traditions. The vegetarian cuisine was raised to a high art, and that's definitely a strong practice in both.
Yeah. Same
Both
with tea
lineage.
too.
Oh yeah, tea. Both in China and Japan would be, again, I think strong practices that you'll find associated with the temples.
So the thing that I was thinking about though in relation to these practices is that with any practice really, they can either help you on the path or when taken to certain extremes, they can actually become attachments and obstructions to the path as well. In regards to cooking, I mean, you can cook and be very meditative, or you can be like Chef Gordon Ramsay and just insult everybody that you know.
Well, my teacher was actually a proponent of cooking, and he used to do an experiment at the temple where he would give people the same recipe, the same ingredients, and have them all cook the same dish. They would taste each other's dishes, and they would taste quite different. And oftentimes people who were going through certain difficulty or had some very strong, especially negative emotions, oftentimes their food turned out pretty bad. So I think, as we mentioned in the last podcast, sometimes those more external practices can be a good mirror to what's going on with us that we may not be fully aware of.
Sometimes that kind of feedback is a bit shocking, definitely.
It can be. One thing I always tell people with Buddhist practices, first, there's no judgment, but secondarily, a lot of these practices, they may be evident to you, but perhaps not as evident to everyone else. So, confession, repentance, or, where these practices show difficulties aren't necessarily something that we need to tell everybody, but most importantly for our own practice, we need to be it needs to be aware to us, or we need to become aware of it in some way. So there are areas where we can take note and say, there's a problem, or there's a difficulty here, but it's not necessarily on display for everyone. So perhaps that encourages us to engage in those practices more, or be more willing or open to find where there may be problems without the benefit of embarrassment, which I think could sometimes be a hurdle when we have a lot of things.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. At least for me, I realized more of my attachments and internal issues when I took up Buddhist chanting and singing as well. And I think part of this is it also teaches a very good lesson in the discriminating mind. Before I knew anything about Buddhist chanting, everything sounded wonderful to me. But then after learning about it, I realized, okay, so that person did that wrong, that person played that instrument wrong, and then it became very critical, at least when I noticed that, and that was kind of my mirror, and I realized, I learned this practice, I'm practicing this practice to get closer to enlightenment, not farther away. So it's kind of difficult, but also very helpful to come back at times and to reevaluate where we are in that practice.
I think that's one of the great benefits of, first, any kind of practice. So to get people out of being sometimes what I refer to as the armchair Buddhist, kind of just reading books about it, getting our hands dirty and doing some sort of practice, but then coming back to the study of the texts. And then I think that back and forth really helps to focus on maybe where our minds have stopped, new obstacles that have come up from doing certain practices. I know a lot of people I meet, and the first question is, well, how many hours a day do you meditate? And it almost becomes a competition, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then, okay, then there's sort of a back and forth, rather than an analysis of maybe how beneficial those practices are, or how much someone's benefited from the practice, or more importantly, how much time you spend helping others. So I think all of those things can be helpful, but we need, and the reason why there are multiple practices within Buddhism is we need more than just one practice. So
So to kind of wrap up this episode, we should talk about the one major practice that we kind of mentioned at the beginning and never touched on again. Meditation, actually. Uh,
Meditation.
so especially in Shingon, what kind of meditations are offered?
So I think the state of affairs with Shingon, especially right now, is most things in English are presented from a scholarly standpoint. So they don't necessarily reflect what's actually happening, available, or a good starting point for a practitioner. So Shingon, of course, does have silent sitting meditation, like every tradition of Buddhism. There's also Sokokan, the vocalization meditation. So it's a very simple mantra meditation with one syllable. The moon disk meditation, which you'll probably see the scrolls and practice at a few of the Shingon temples outside Japan, here in the United States and Brazil. And then famously the Ajikan meditation. So a little bit of information is available about that. But those seated meditation methods involve visualization and vocalization rather than just, I think what unfortunately a lot of more popular books on meditation often just say, it's silent sitting or clearing the mind is the object or goal. So Shingon uses a lot of visualization or mantra in the practice. So those practices can be very helpful to people. Very beneficial to give some alternatives to what seems to be the most popular thing right now, which is silent sitting meditation.
Gotcha. Okay. And does Shingon also have breath meditation? That's what I started off with in Chan Buddhism, Chinese Chan, and Zen Buddhism.
Yes, absolutely. So some of the very first practices I learned in Shingon were breath meditation, either counting the breath, focusing on the breath, or breath control. So there was actually quite a variety there. And I think that also tends to be something that outside of maybe traditional Buddhist temples, those where, the teachers have come over from Asia, when I've visited other centers, tend to get maybe watered down or overly simplified as only one method. So even within that, the usage of the breath, focusing on the breath, there's quite a variety of teachings.
Gotcha, yeah. And would you consider the Goma ritual also a meditation?
The Goma fire ritual, yeah, absolutely. That is probably one of the most challenging of meditations in Shingon. And this is purely my very Western American explanation. The Goma is one of the few meditations where you can go and watch someone's meditation manifested externally. So you can see what's going on. You can watch it happening. Hopefully I'll get a video up pretty soon of one of the Gomas recently at one of the temples here in the U.S. so people can get a little idea of what's going on there. But that's definitely one area where you wouldn't think of meditation because it appears so active, but it definitely is a very challenging meditation.
Gotcha. Okay. So I guess this is a good place to stop for this episode. And then in the next one, we can talk more about what Shingon practices are available to the laity and the non-ordained Shingon practitioners.
That would be good. I think there's probably a lot of confusion on that point, but also more than any email I get, that's probably the biggest email I get is what type of practices are available.
All right. Until next time, Sensei, thank you so much for your teaching.
Thank you. It's good to talk to you again.